Alright, we're about to start talking about 19A, but let's back up here to 19. The student will identify the origins, we talked about that in the last video, major developments and the domestic impact of World War II, especially the growth of the federal government. We're going to look at here some of the major developments, one of them we're about to talk about, and in its domestic impact of World War II. So let's talk about that, developments. Explain A. Philip Randolph's proposed march on Washington, D.C. and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's response. Okay, so we're talking about A. Philip Randolph's march, his proposed march. It never happens, but we want to talk about why A. Philip Randolph wanted to do this march on Washington, D.C. It's eventually going to happen in 1963 with Martin Luther King Jr. And we're going to talk about that in Unit 9. But we want to talk about the elements A. Philip Randolph and his proposed march on Washington, D.C. And the theme here is domestic impact of World War II. Let's jump into that. FDR in 1940, actually. In 1940, this is a speech he gave in 1941, and right after, December 7th, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But even before FDR, in 1940, FDR was trying to get the United States, and was successful in doing it, to make war goods and get prepared because he knew what was coming. And he wanted to help out Great Britain as well. So he gave this in his address to Congress in December 1941. Powerful enemies must be outfought and outproduced. It is not enough to turn out just a few more planes, a few more tanks, a few more guns, a few more ships that can be turned out by our enemies. We must outproduce them overwhelmingly, so that there can be no question of our ability to provide a crushing superiority of equipment in any theater of world war. So he wants to produce these war materials, and in order for FDR to do that, he opens up a couple of boards like the war production boards that to get the economy changed over to producing these things. And as a result, in 1940 and 1941, a bunch of war industries start making war goods. And what I mean by that, and we call these the defense industries, is that they're going to make army tanks, airplanes, guns, ships, mortars, bullets, whatever, you name it. That's what they're going to do, preparing for war, changing the economy to a military economy rather than a domestic one. Okay, so many industries in the United States were already making these war materials, or these defense industries already making these. But other industries like Ford Motor Company and Chevrolet, who were making automobiles for home, and Singer Sewing Machine making sewing machines for women to sew clothing on, they're going to convert their production from those domestic goods to war making goods. That's called wartime conversion, and we're going to talk about that later. But the problem at the time was all these industries doing this were not allowing African Americans to be hired and get these jobs where they could make some money during the Great Depression. So African Americans were largely being discriminated against. In the airplane industry, I can't tell you where I've heard it quoted that not many African Americans were in that industry, but there were about, I think, 250 out of 10,000 workers, and they were usually just cleaning up the place. But anyway, the war industries here discriminated against African Americans and would not hire them like they should. And we are going to see A. Philip Randolph here. A. Philip Randolph is going to get tired of this. A. Philip Randolph has a history in labor unions. He is a labor union leader. Actually, the first African American labor union was created and founded by A. Philip Randolph. It was called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And these sleeping cars, if you remember, was the George Pullman Company that we talked about that had a strike. Pullman Palace Car Company had these sleeping cars, and these porters were mostly African Americans, and they would carry the bags of the people on the train in these sleeping cars. They would bring them a newspaper if they wanted it, food and all sorts of items, take care of their belongings. They pretty much were manservants on these sleeping cars. But he formed a union called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, was the first black union, and in it he fights for labor rights for African Americans. And the reason why he had to do that is because the FL and the Knights of Labor did not allow African American union members, so he creates the first black one. So that's where he comes into history here as a great leader, and he is going to put pressure on President FDR. Here he is here. He proposes a march on Washington, D.C. to protest the discrimination in the war industries. Not only that African Americans are not being hired in these war industries, defense industries, making these weapons and things that were needed, like planes and tanks and all, but the military also discriminated against African Americans. They segregated groups and didn't use these African Americans for war or for anything engaging, just used them for preparation and move things around. Minimum type of effect. But he's going to put pressure on Roosevelt to issue an executive order that called for employers and labor unions to cease, all those in the industries, to cease discrimination and hiring practice in the industries related to the defense of the United States. And as a result, Roosevelt's action, his march was canceled. A. Philip Randolph canceled his march. It was only proposed, it never did happen, but he proposed to march 100,000 African Americans into Washington, D.C. And so here's what A. Philip Randolph says: in this period of power politics, nothing counts but pressure, and still more pressure, through the tactic and strategy of broad, organized, aggressive mass action behind the vital and important issues of the Negro. To this end, we propose that 10,000 Negroes march on Washington for jobs and national defense and equal integration in the fighting forces of the United States. And that's what A. Philip Randolph wanted, equality for African Americans. Here's some of the flyers that went out. Straighten up and come right to the March on Washington movement. And it says discrimination in jobs, for abolition of Jim Crow in the armed forces. Discrimination in housing, for abolition of Jim Crow in the armed forces. That means the segregation that was happening. In other words, he wanted them to be able to fight as well and to all be in one group. Discrimination in housing, a permanent FEPC, and we're going to talk about the FEPC in just a moment. They're going to actually get that. So he puts pressure on President Roosevelt, and Roosevelt didn't really want to meet with Randolph, and really didn't want to do this because he had other pressing concerns. And we see that in his address to Congress, and I'm going to show it to you in a minute. But anyway, eventually he gives in, and he says, he gives Executive Order 8802. He really didn't want to do that. A. Philip Randolph actually wrote the Executive Order 8802 and proposed it, and FDR agreed to it and gave it. He said, there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. And so that was a win for African Americans. But the FEPC was a Fair Employment Practices Committee, was set up to investigate reports of discriminations made by African Americans, so legitimate complaints could be heard about African Americans in the military or not being given a job in the defense industries. Now, people criticize FDR for not immediately doing this on his own, and it wasn't that he was against African Americans, it's just he had other things that were more pressing in his mind, and that was war production. And we can see that in his address here, 1941. He says, the nation expects our defense industries to continue preparation. Let me let him read it to you.
The nation expects our defense industries to continue operation without interruption by strikes or lockouts. It expects and insists that management and workers will reconcile their differences by voluntary or legal means to continue to produce the supplies that are so sorely needed.
Now, what he feared was that A. Philip Randolph's march on Washington would cause for African Americans and whites to conflict with one another, somebody get hurt, maybe there'd be riots, and he didn't want to do this because he was concentrating on getting this war production stuff made to send to Great Britain to help them during. In other words, he felt that Hitler was more of a concern than these African American labor issues. But that is A. Philip Randolph's proposed march on Washington, D.C., President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's response to it. And those are developments during World War II, an impact at home with the war industries. Okay, ask questions in class. Good luck on the quiz. Test the EOCT. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's response. Okay, so we're talking about A. Philip Randolph's march, his proposed march. It never happens, but we want to talk about why A. Philip Randolph wanted to do this march on Washington, D.C. It's eventually going to happen in 1963. The major developments, one of them we're about to talk about, and in its domestic impact of World War II. So let's talk about that. Developments. Explaining A. Philip Randolph's proposed march on Washington, D.C. with Martin Luther King Jr. And we're going to talk about that in Unit 9. But we want to talk about the elements A. Philip Randolph and his proposed march on Washington, D.C. And the theme here is domestic impact of World War II. Let's jump into that. FDR. Alright, we're about to start talking about 19A, but let's back up here to 19. The student will identify the origins, we talked about that in the last video, major developments and the domestic impact of World War II, especially the growth of the federal government. We'll look at here some in 1940 actually. In 1940, this is a speech he gave in 1941, and right after, December 7th, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But even before FDR, in 1940, FDR was trying